I think it's been. Um, he's done so much organizing there that they've really accomplished a lot. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So, are you ready for me now? Okay. Well, first, I want to thank my friend Chuck Pinocchio for asking me to be here this evening, and to all of you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you. I do really appreciate this opportunity to speak about reaching out to and working with people of faith, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about us. And I can understand why, because so often we're mischaracterized in the media that sometimes I even wonder who we are. But let me tell you a little bit more about myself and the organization I work for. On a very personal level, I have lived for years with partners, spouses who have dealt with really pretty awful health issues. And we have made it through because we have had access to good insurance. And we know that we are very fortunate to have that. I have good insurance through my denominational plan, and my husband was actually covered through my plan, and now he's on Medicare. But he has had multiple health issues, not the least of which is a form of cancer that is very difficult to deal with. So, we realize how fortunate we are. But I'm a minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, and I was ordained in 2004. I attended seminary in my 40s, so this is not my first career. And in fact, I would describe the journey I've been through as far as faith goes as somewhat checkered. But that's a topic for another time. Um, Prior to that, I spent a number of years working around environmental issues at the federal level, county level, the nonprofit level, and private sector. Um, the last was not my favorite. Lots of emphasis on billable hours, which was not something I liked particularly. Um, I looked at that work as well as the work that I do now through a public policy lens or a policy analysis lens, because I also have a Master of Arts in Public Policy Studies. And because I work primarily with people of faith, I often view myself as an interpreter. So often taking really wonky issues and translating them into a language that people of faith without that kind of background can understand, and then providing the rationale for positions that we speak to based on our understanding of scripture and denominational positions. Now, I think this background makes me somewhat uniquely qualified for my position at the Council of Churches as Director of Advocacy. I operate there under a set of principles that are based on scripture, denominational positions, and two basic principles: a call to love our neighbors as ourselves and to treat others as we would wish to be treated, what we often refer to as the golden rule. And I think that's the simplest way that I usually communicate with the folks that I communicate with. I also follow the priorities of an advisory group that sets basic direction for my work, but it's flexible enough to permit me to respond as needed based on rapid changes and shifts in the policy arena. We typically take fairly strong positions that go farther than we think legislators or policymakers may be prepared to go, though we are prepared to be pragmatic if we believe something really does move us forward without any harm to the cause that our ultimate goal. Um, but we do continue to press for that ultimate goal, to continue voicing where we want to be, and that even if we do accept something that isn't quite there, we will continue to say this isn't enough. We need to go further. Over 10 years ago, the Council of Churches took a position in support of single-payer health care for Pennsylvania. And we determined that this was the only way that we could guarantee fair access to quality, affordable, comprehensive care for all Pennsylvanians. And we continue to stand by that position. In speaking about this over the years, I've continued to assert that this position is not just um, justifiable, but it is something that we as Christians are required to work for. And if we're going to call ourselves Christians, that is, followers of Christ, then we need to follow the example of Jesus, who was a healer and cared for all people, regardless of where they were. People who lived on the margins. He was much more likely to um, be a healer for those who were struggling. So, and there are many examples, of course, in Scripture where he was healing critically ill persons, and I have said in the past that, of course, that means he specialized in dealing with pre-existing conditions, which many of our healthcare plans don't want to do. He never refused to heal those who had long-standing disabilities or illnesses. But I think the question here is how people in this movement might move forward to approach and partner more with people of faith. And I would say the answer is it depends. Um, First, I want to make the point that we're not a monolith. You all probably know that, but I'm deeply saddened and often anchored by how we as people of faith are sometimes portrayed in the media. There's a small segment of the faith community that has managed to commandeer and control the narrative in many media outlets. And that segment in no way represents what I believe to be the majority of us. What we see is that so-called people of faith that you often see in the media are often intolerant and hateful. And they not only oppose health care for all, but equal pay, equal rights for women, reproductive choice, rights for persons who don't fit neatly into gender categories, immigration, and all those other things. They are often seen as supporting the rights of others to reject access based on race, immigration status, or gender identity. And they identified those who are not like them as other or less than or not deserving of dignity or respect. This is not how most of us, the people that I work with, identify. Sure, we have differences and disagreements, but I would assert that most of us are very concerned that our sisters and brothers, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, economic status, any of those things, are treated with respect, with the respect that they deserve, and that they all have the need to grow and to thrive. So ensuring that all have access to healthcare is an essential piece of that equation. Now, second, the faith community has actually played a really big role in some of the greatest movements in this country. At least in the northern states, the faith community was very much engaged in working to end slavery in our country. And then Walter Rauschenbusch, who was a Baptist minister and a professor, was a father of the social gospel movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And he asserted at that time that the church had an essential role in the fight against systemic injustice among all groups and for every person. And he worked hard to promote this work. We were also integral to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and with Dr. Martin Luther King being the most visible, of course, of the faith voices that were advocating for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and other progressive legislation that related to to racial justice. The last real push that I am aware of as a community came with the movement against nuclear proliferation in the early 1980s. Now, unfortunately, I think primarily because of the rise of the religious right through the late 70s and the emergence of the so-called moral majority supporting the candidacy of Ronald Reagan, there's been significant mistrust of faith communities and our commitment to working toward social justice on the part of most progressive movements over the past 40 years. And I can't say that I blame those movements. I mean, I consider myself a progressive, but if I were on the outside and didn't understand this, I might be questioning too. We who support full and equal rights for all people, as well as laws and policies that ensure fair treatment, safety, and justice for all, are still here, and we're here in significant numbers. Um, we're often not seen or heard because of fundamentalist so-called evangelical traditions that have often captured the media narrative. But we do continue this work through groups such as the one I work for and the efforts of individual denominations. And I think like all of us who are doing this kind of work, we are vastly underfunded, and that makes it hard to really break into and break out so that we're heard more than we are able to be heard. So how do you reach out to people to develop partnerships, people of faith to develop partnerships? I would say first, it really helps to look first to your friends, your family, your neighbors, and I'm sure that all of you probably know people of faith who are interested in doing this work. Um, what are their concerns? Do they share your concern about ensuring access to affordable, comprehensive health care for all? Do they know the concerns of their own respective communities of faith? Do they have relationships with their denomination or faith tradition with regard to what they're doing in this arena? If so, are they able to connect with you and share information within their own networks, and how you can kind of build upon who you know and who they know? I'd also suggest reaching out where you can to state ecumenical organizations or other organizations that are similar to the one that I work with. And that means, in my case, an organization that represents a variety of Christian traditions. There are interfaith organizations that do this kind of work as well. Um, and particularly with interfaith, I think, if you're going to be doing interfaith work, that people have to be, somewhat open, more likely to be open to a range of ideas and interests. You can do a little online research to develop, to determine receptivity, possibly in organizations that you might have an interest in. So, for example, if you were to Google the Pennsylvania Council of Churches, you would find that most of our issue-oriented work would be aimed at promoting the welfare of all people. And I can tell you that most Christian denominations, at least at the national level, will be receptive as well. My own tradition, Presbyterian, actually did adopt a position in support of single payer um, over 10 years ago now. But many of the what are known as mainline denominations, so Lutherans, Methodists, Episcopalians, and so on, and the historic peace traditions like the Quakers and the Church of the Brethren, are often going to have fairly progressive stances toward health care and other things that would be of concern. I should say the Unitarian Universalists are certainly on board, and so I don't think there's much of a question about that. There are an awful lot of Roman Catholics who will be receptive. There are certainly, I can't tell you the exact positions of all these organizations, but I have regular contact with them, and I'm certainly willing to work where I can to try to build some of this. Many of you may be familiar with the Nuns on the Bus movement. There's an organization called Network that is behind that, and it's now I've just gone absolutely blank on her name, Sister Simone, who's the person. She's been on Colbert and a number of other places, so she's really been out there. But there's others like the Franciscan Action Network and a number of the women religious groups that work diligently for social justice. When it comes to some who identify as evangelical, it depends. There are significant portions of that community who are or would be supportive, however. Some of you may be familiar with Sojourners or the Reverend Jim Wallace. They are a progressive evangelical organization. They've been around for years and years. I actually interviewed Jim Wallace on the nuclear freeze movement back in the early 80s when I was in grad school. So and I think he started this back in the 70s. There's some Christians who follow along with the Evangelicals for Social Action, which has involved Tony Campolo, who is associated with Eastern University here in Pennsylvania. They're much more of a progressive evangelical group. Also, there's an organization called Red Letter Christians. Shane Claiborne, who is a younger activist, I say younger, I think he's in his 40s at this point, so he's not young, but this is a non-denominational movement that aims to take the words of Jesus seriously, i.e. the red letter designation, because there are a number of Bibles that use red ink specifically for the words of Jesus, so following that. So I think these are folks who would be much more receptive to hearing from this movement, and certainly I have some relationships in those movements, and would be more than willing to help where I can. I would also encourage reaching out to the Poor People's Campaign. And the Poor People's Campaign as a movement supports access to affordable, comprehensive health care. I can't say specifically, but I think they actually do support single payer. And this movement is led by faith leaders. So most notably, the Reverend Dr. William Barber, who was behind the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina, is very charismatic and very persuasive and a wonderful speaker, preacher. But also the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, who's been associated with Union Seminary in New York for years and years. This was her vision going back probably 20 years. I went to a couple of events there and got to know her. Her vision was to revive the Poor People's Campaign that Martin Luther King was trying to move along back in the late 60s before he was assassinated, and to forward the notion of the beloved community. I should add, however, and you may run into some of this, there's significant fear in the faith community. Fear of change. The fear of change is high. Fear that disagreement among people in denominations and congregations could cause further divisions and cause loss of members. I've actually read evidence to the contrary, and I can tell you my own church here in Harrisburg, I think, is evidence to the contrary, where we are radically welcoming, and we're the only church in our presbytery that's actually growing at this point. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I wouldn't expect that you would find typically entire congregations or church bodies who would join wholeheartedly in the march toward universal single-payer health care very often. But there are some who will make that kind of commitment. And as I mentioned, the Presbyterian Church has done that. And there are some individual congregations in my own denomination that have done that. But there are always people in at least our community who are looking for ways they can plug in and make a difference when their own denominations or congregations are not doing that. So when you're able to connect with people like this, and as I've said a couple of times already, folks like myself can help, it really does provide an opportunity to broaden the network and to add faith voices that have been instrumental to such movements in the past. And in the meantime, people like me are trying to restore the strong voice and authority that the faith community once held in movements like this one. And I think we're moving in that direction, but we certainly aren't there yet. So I think I'm going to stop there, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to entertain them. Yeah. Michael?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, Sandy. I resonate a lot with what you said. We in Oregon, the UCC conference passed a resolution in September 2018 endorsing universal health care. And that was after a year of calling and recalling and emailing and re-emailing. And we're going to resume that now. Healthcare for All Oregon has reestablished a faith caucus, and Richard Staggenborg has just joined us, and he's helping to lead that effort. Questions I would have for you are, you're pastor in a church, and somebody from another church drops an email or a phone call on your desk saying, we want to share our information with your congregation about universal health care. How have you reached out? How have people reached out to you? What seems to be most effective? What should you put in the subject line?
I have reached out. I haven't done this much lately because of some other work that I've had to be involved in more recently related to grants that we have. But typically what happens is I will alert people to the our willingness to do that kind of presentation in a congregation. Often what I'll find is pastors who are way ahead of their congregations, and they'll see a lot of differences within their congregations, will look at this as an opportunity to have somebody other than themselves come in and talk about this. And so, it doesn't put the pastor in a position of being the advocate for this, but it does give them an opportunity to offer more education around this. And I think that's a really good way to approach it, to say, look, I think it's just important that, we're not hearing what we really need to hear a lot of times through the media. And we really we want to help you to understand that this is not this frightening socialist movement that is going to, take over our country and become dictatorial. And, that really nearly everyone is struggling with healthcare. So I think, there's a lot of concern there, and there is some willingness to hear if there are, if there's alternatives, which we know this is a wonderful alternative to the really broken system we have right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Andy, one of the
sorry.
things that I was wondering if you could talk about is how to frame the conversation for the faith community in shared values. We are learning from our movement that only talking about facts and figures is not persuasive enough, and that we need to frame the conversation in values that will engage the listener. And you've probably learned this from your work, whether you were talking about nuclear energy or environmental protection, that this is a major theme. And people like myself are struggling to figure out how to frame this conversation about access to healthcare in a way that engages the faith community. So we would love to have some guidance from you very specifically about how would we frame it in shared values that both progressives and liberals believe in,
Mhm.
And if you would share your email with me, I would send you my PowerPoint, which is sadly lacking
Mm.
in that area, and think that you could help me with that.
I would be very happy to share my email. Actually, how about if I drop it into the chat?
Mhm.
That might be the easiest. I'll do that in a minute. But um, I think what I would say is there isn't necessarily a one size fits all, other than the two things that I spoke to earlier, which I have found have been the best way and the simplest way, which is loving your neighbor. Every faith tradition I could think of certainly speaks to loving your neighbor. And the other is, that idea of the golden rule: treat others as you wish to be treated. And I think that is, maybe the easiest way to say, we share these values as progressives, as liberals, as people of faith. I'm thinking, I know a number of progressive liberal folks who are not necessarily in the faith community. I have, friends that span the spectrum, but we all share that. Now, as far as addressing specific faith groups, maybe a specific denomination or a specific faith tradition, I would do a little research up front to see what their tradition has to say about this, because then if you know that up front, then you can look at more persuasive ways of getting through if they don't agree, and you don't belabor it if they already are on board. Now, certainly in any organization or in any congregation or any setting, you're going to find differences of opinion. But I think just sort of being prepared, knowing where at least they come from at that at that denominational level helps. And if you happen to know somebody in the congregation or in the group, you might want to take some time to speak with them in advance to see what some of the roadblocks or the barriers that you're going to find to being heard. I don't know if that helps or not, but um, that's
That does
probably
help.
the.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And I think, Betty, you were getting ready to ask something too.
Yeah, so when you responded to Mike, that really caught me by surprise. So when I have reached out to churches, I have typically gone on their website to see whether they have a mission committee, and if they have a mission committee, I reach out to them, and then I ask if they have an interest, and I almost, unless it's the Unitarian Universalist Church, they universally say no. Now, I have had ministers reach out to me and ask me if I would come speak. And so the aha there is the ministers are often more progressive. So I was going to less progressive people asking if they wanted me to come and speak. And I
Yeah,
never would have thought of that. I was thinking I was trying to go through the proper channels and not annoy the minister who has so many things to take care of.
right.
But I should actually be going directly to the minister. I had not thought of that.
Well, yeah, I think it depends again. I mean, and I've had individuals in congregations who say, "Look, I'm not getting anywhere with our mission committee or our social justice committee or whatever committee it is, or the pastor." But they'll ask if they have an opportunity to do so. They'll ask me to come and present. Um, they know that it's going to be an uphill, that it's going to be a heavy lift to get people really on board, but it's an opportunity to at least get your foot in the door and be heard. And I would do that. Just be prepared for pushback and in those circumstances.
And be
So if
persistent.
you
Yeah,
So when you're doing your research, if you look at the website and you see a mission committee that talks about healthcare justice, then you go to the mission committee. And if you don't see anything under the mission committee about healthcare, then go to the minister.
right. Well, I will tell you, in my own denomination, when I see committees that call themselves social justice, what they really are is a mission committee that is doing more charity oriented work. and people get confused between what is charity and what is social justice or being an advocate. So that's something to be aware of as well.
Eric had his hand up.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for joining this, and I'm really glad I was able to participate. What exactly is the ask when we reach out to faith-based groups? Is it like, what's your experience? Is it just virtual turnout in this day and age to events, or like calling legislatures, like aside from like please join our organization or whatever, like what are you actually asking the congregation members to do?
Well, I view it first, more than anything, as an educational opportunity. Now, I never would waste an educational opportunity without asking people to do something. So, but you got to get in there and be able to talk about this first. What I usually do is encourage people first to join our network. I have an e-advocacy network statewide so that they can begin to kind of see the kinds of work that we do and so on. And I will encourage people, hey, if you think this is the way to go, here's the bills that we have in play in our legislature, and I would encourage you to write to your legislators, to call your legislators. Don't just do sort of the click and send stuff, personalize things. Make sure that you make it clear that this is something that's personal to you. Personal stories, if you have them. I'm one of the bills that I'm working on right now in Pennsylvania is dealing with prescription drug costs. And my husband is on a cancer drug that if we had to pay the copay, it's being waived by AstraZeneca, but if we had to pay the copay, we'd be paying $2,800 a month. So, and so I talk about how fortunate we are, but how often there are people who would not be able to get that kind of treatment that they would need. And Michael, you talked about that, or no, it was Peter who talked about that. Not being able to get access to needed treatments. Stories are powerful. They really are. And so the other thing is I would encourage people to write letters to the editor. I provide some guidance on that. So I think those things are all important as well. And to reach out to friends and neighbors and family and encourage them. Because, you go in and talk to, say, a Sunday school class or something like that, well, you may get anywhere from, I don't know, 5 to 20 people. Maybe you'll get more. But encouraging them if you sense that they're on board to begin talking to other people they know, and encouraging them to invite us to come in and do that kind of work in other congregations.
Thank you.
Yeah, Peter?
One thing I left out of my presentation earlier, which really belonged in there, but I think it pertains to what you're talking about too, is the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Black and brown people, who are 2 and 3 times more likely to be infected, 2 or 3 times more likely to die.
Right.
A lot of it has to do with lack of access to treatment, but also like the horribly unhealthy conditions that people have to live under.
Right.
I know in East Oakland there are a lot of multi-generational families that are crowded together in housing. One person gets sick, everybody gets sick. There are people who live in food deserts where they can't get access to fresh food. There are people whose immune systems are compromised in all sorts of ways because they live near, a toxic waste dump or something like that would never be tolerated in a white neighborhood. How have you approached that?
Well, You know, I did not mention that in what I said, obviously, but yeah, this is where a lot of our efforts have been focused more recently in addressing racial injustice. And so looking at that as an opportunity to talk about, well, one, about all the issues that we deal with. Now, certainly in this case, the lack of access to health care and the fact that there's a lack of access to a lot of basic needs, which results in comorbidities that make the situation a lot worse for Black and brown people. It's an opportunity to say that these things, not only do we need health care for all, but all of these things are interconnected. So, we need the health care, but we also need adequate nutrition. We need adequate housing. One of the statements that I've heard referred to quite often is housing is health. If you're in a stable housing situation, you're likely to be healthier than those who aren't. But you also need access to decent education and all those other things because they all interact. And so I usually take the opportunity not just to say, oh, we need to build a more just system for people of color, but we also need to fix all these other things. And in fact, for those who question, well, there's also white people that are affected. Well, certainly there are, but a lot of that has to do with socioeconomic conditions, which are also problematic, and so people don't have access to those things. But it's predominantly a problem, more of a problem for Black and brown people. So I view it as an opportunity to begin to do more education on that front. Any other questions?
I'm sending, I'll put in the chat something to address the experience you and your husband had with the pricing of medications. And they are a series of videos that Dr. David Belk did on previous sessions about the collusion of the pharmaceutical industry and the insurance industry to create prices that are astronomically high. And then you get this really good deal with a copay. So you pay only 1/10 of what the asking price was. But if you shop around, you probably find pharmacies that will sell you the pills at 1/10 of the copay. And so just go and not mention insurance. That's true for most. That's true for 7 out of 8 medications that are prescribed today.
Yes, unfortunately, it isn't for the one my husband is on because there is only one source. But yes, that's absolutely true. And at one point, we were buying some of his heart medications from Canada and other places. So yes, we are aware of that. And I will talk about that not as openly because there are people who have problems with that. But yes, you're absolutely right. Shop around. It makes a lot of sense. So I don't want to, I know that you all are planning to move into this other discussion time, and I don't want to, keep you going beyond that, but I'm happy to be here as long as you have any other questions. And if not.
Yeah.
So actually,
I've got a question.
Oh, okay.
Did you have a question, Betty?
No, I was just going to say that there's not a rush. So basically the way the schedule was that if we had 30 people, we wanted to break into groups of 6 or 10 or something, then we could break out into breakout groups.
Right.
There's no reason to break up now.
Right.
And as far as networking, I didn't know Eric before tonight. I don't know Carol. I've seen her on a couple of calls, but we're getting to know each other here, so that's fine. There's not really another plan right now for this evening.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is Chuck. I just made a note here. There's other faith communities that go beyond your discussion, and it's not in your probably in the scope of your work. But just wonder, what are the best ways to connect to the Jewish community, to the Muslim community, to Sikhs, to Buddhists, to Hindus, and so forth. I mean, do you have connections in those worlds, or do we? I mean, I imagine that we're really going to need to recruit other faith community leaders to make this a truly effective movement building process, right? I mean, peer-to-peer connection is certainly the most powerful. Any thoughts or reflections on that, Sandy?
I can't say that I have those connections nationwide. I do have some good connections here in Pennsylvania, although they are primarily in the central Pennsylvania area. I've worked pretty closely with the Muslim community, and there is for example, here there's a state chapter of CARE. So, I don't know how many other states. That's the Council on American Islamic Relations, which some have tried to label a terrorist group. But anyway, they are, and in fact, the Muslim community in Pennsylvania actually does a legislative day in Harrisburg, and I've gone to speak as an ally with that group in the past. The Jewish community is a little more fragmented, and you have the same thing that you have with the Christian community, is that there's different movements of Judaism. So, but there are also, now there is a Pennsylvania Jewish Coalition. They are really much more, they're almost much more like a corporate or, a special interest group than we are. We do advocacy not that benefits us, but on behalf or in partnership with others working more towards social justice. But there are local Jewish groups. For example, here in Harrisburg, I work quite closely with the Jewish Federation of Central Pennsylvania, and there are those sort of groups around the state. There don't tend to be overarching, at least state level, groups for the Buddhists or the Hindus or the Baha'is. Again, when I work with those groups here, I typically work most closely with the folks here in central Pennsylvania, and when we begin to try to reach out across the state, I rely on those partners who I've built those relationships with to help with that work. So I think it really helps with other traditions to spend a little time getting to know the people who are closest to you, and then to be able to branch out from there.
Right, and this spills into immigrant communities as well, with a lot of these more, say, less central or more peripheral or smaller minority traditions of faith as well. So, and they've got urgent issues, as you know, with the Dreamers and other immigrants who face potential immediate deportation, especially under our neo-fascist president.
Yeah. Well, and there are significant, I know here in Pennsylvania we have, and I can't, we have a group called CASA. We have another MILPA, which is the Movement for Immigrant Leadership in Pennsylvania. And that tends to be a lot of younger immigrants, a lot of particularly Latinx folks. And there's going to be those kinds of organizations in various states, and I know, for example, the MILPA, the group that I just mentioned here in Harrisburg, a number of them are also Roman Catholic, and they're associated with one of the local Catholic churches. So that's perhaps another way of reaching.
Right. I mean, if I could, and not to dominate here, but if I could just make an overarching comment, and this is based in part on our conversation the other day, just to get you oriented with One Pair States, as well as the other group I'm working with, which is Justice for All Network, is that a lot of these folks don't necessarily identify as progressives, even though they have a lot of the same common concerns.
Right.
And I wonder if you can speak to that question as to what it is that we need to do as a predominantly white, progressive, even white collar community. What it is that we need to do to win hearts and minds? I mean, especially with the Black Lives Movement just taking off, but also, there are some questions about where that goes forward. But all these other communities, just the question of how do we engage these other communities through the prism of religion, but also through the prism of the issues that we commonly share. Thanks, Sandy.
And I don't know that I have an easy answer for that. I think, I've been at this particular job for 16 years now. And it has been a constant process of relationship building. And one of the things that's been most difficult is really building those bridges into the African American community throughout Pennsylvania. And partially it's because, I speak the language of a white person, and so, it's harder to be heard. What I have learned over the years is, as I begin to find individuals who trust me and who I can connect with, they will begin to help in making more of those introductions into their communities. And where I've found that has worked best is in connecting with African American women who seem to be much more receptive than a lot of the African American men who, in many cases, are a little on the sexist side. So it's been a constant process, and I'm not there yet. It just goes on and on, but it's gotten a lot better in the last few years as I've begun really developing those relationships with individuals who then say, hey, this person is with us and you can trust her. And I think that's really almost the only way you can do it.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, we certainly look forward to your participating in the monthly One Pair of States call coming up. With our other guest, Willie, who I've spoken with you about. I think we really need to bring you in front of a larger gathering. I mean, this is a late hour. It's difficult, I think, for people in the East, maybe Midwest. A little easier on the West Coast. This is kind of how we were playing it. But I think the monthly call is going to be a great opportunity to share just these really, really rich thoughts and reflections. Because we're only going to succeed if we reach beyond our own community, and the moral fiber that ties us together is so powerful. And Sandy, I've known you for years. I just think you are just a gift, and thank you for coming on tonight. I hope I didn't cut any other questions off, but I just didn't want to let that go unsaid. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Chuck. Thank you. I think Michael had one question. I think I saw him.
Yeah, thanks. Two questions. The Catholic Church in Corvallis has been very progressive in reaching out to help the underserved, and yet abortion is still a kind of a wall. We got a leader here who belonged to the church, got 8 members of the church, all women except one man, to talk about this in a couple of hours. And it did get to the elephant in the room, and they talked openly about it. And that's when the discussion of how other countries with a very strong Catholic tradition have dealt with this. And so they wanted to extend that discussion farther in the church, and they went to the leader of the Knights of Columbus and got scathed. And this was damnation, that you might allow abortion. So that's one question of, not that church would not support, it's a matter of how do you approach somebody where that is going to be a strong, not just in the Catholic Church, but others. And the other is, I know we talked a little bit about the Hispanic community. We have never seen a Hispanic face in our UCC church, as liberal as we think we are.
Mhm.
And it's sort of a foreign culture, I think, for somebody with a Hispanic background to walk into our culture.
Right.
Any suggestions for either of those?
Oh gosh. I don't have a really good suggestion in either case. I haven't had to deal with the questions around abortion a whole lot. On the other hand, I'm really kind of prevented from talking about it because even with our own membership, not everybody agrees. So you have everything from the UCC to some Orthodox traditions that are fairly conservative and so on. So, it's something that I don't have cause to talk about much. So if I am talking about it, it's typically on an individual basis. And one of the things, I think, and this is probably, sort of how an awful lot of people deal with it, which is that no one that I know is pro-abortion. There are circumstances that are just, they're very personal to each person, and that it's really difficult for us to judge how someone else decides what to do with the pregnancy. And that is a decision that needs to be made between a woman and her doctor and God, as far as I'm concerned. That and then the other thing is that if you're going to talk about trying to outlaw or make abortion a lot harder, we really need to do a better job of promoting birth control or ways of avoiding unwanted pregnancies.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not a great answer, but that's typically the kind of discussion that I have. In terms of getting people of other cultures into the church, I try this. In my congregation, it's not that hard because we do have a fairly diverse congregation, but depending on where you are, if there's someone who feel shares some common interests and common sense of faith who happens to come from one of those communities, I would certainly just invite them and say, there's no need to make a commitment here, but come and check us out and spend a Sunday morning with us, actually, or spend a Sunday morning on Zoom or whatever it happens to be these days. But it's hard when someone who is not part of the dominant group within a congregation, it's just hard. And I know from my own experience of walking into audiences in my past work on recycling and waste management, I would walk in to talk to audiences that were primarily male, for example, and that's hard. Or, being one of only one or two white persons going into a black audience can be difficult. And so you can imagine how that feels for someone else. So, again, not very good, but
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, Betty?
So thank you so much for the insight. We're supposed to be talking about the healthcare, so it's interesting that we're also on the topics that Mike and I are very interested in as well, but we might be boring Stefan and Carol, I don't know. Rick, I know would be interested too. But I wanted to just share something with Mike that a Catholic woman, I can't remember if it was an in-person interview or if this was something that I saw online. It feels like I spoke to this person and they told me directly, but it was a nun who was saying that from the UK, that because they had the social supports, that a woman had more opportunities. She didn't have to worry about how would she pay for the delivery. She didn't have to worry about, getting the care for the baby afterward. And there were more social supports for housing and food and stuff.
Absolutely.
So having those social supports made fewer women want to have abortions.
Good.
And so
Yeah.
that was the reason that the Catholics in the UK, which is not a huge population compared to, say, Italy or something, but the Catholics in the UK had come on board with it, or at least her group of progressive Catholics maybe, or something.
Well, the funny thing is that I think Catholics in Italy and places like that are not as fundamentalist on that issue as we are here, which is really interesting. Yeah.
I just meant more in terms of the percentage of how many Catholics there were.
Yeah.
More, yeah.
And there are, I mean, there actually is an organization, Catholics for Choice. I don't know how they work with their compatriots who are not pro-choice, but
Right. So if people don't mind going on this hot topic of multiculturalism within a church setting and without worrying about the healthcare, maybe Chuck wants to sign out now, I don't know, but I know you have surgery tomorrow, right?
yeah.
Yeah, early tomorrow. I do. Hey, before I lose track here, before Carol cuts out, Carol Federa, are you there, Carol?
Yes, I am.
I was trying to connect with you in the chat. Could you send me an email, Carol? I just want to find out what happened with your California legislator, if you could. Just drop me a line. This is Chuck, cpinocchio@gmail.com. Sorry to cut in here. I was trying to reach Carol because we're trying to get a legislative sponsor for the single-payer bill in California. Just another track. Sorry to interrupt.
Great. That's great.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. I know Sandy can appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Legislative sponsor interrupt us here. Right. Yeah, my surgery's in the morning. Thanks for the well-wishing. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Sandy,
Yes.
you've been at this job for 16 years. Tell me a little more about what that's involved and how do you stay so calm and staying at the job? Sounds like a tough one.
I don't always stay so calm. I think I'm fortunate that I am able to present that exterior a lot of the time. But you know, I spend far too much time. I've always been a news junkie. I follow things really closely, and then I get angry, and I want to say things that I shouldn't, and I really have to sit with that for a bit before I say something I shouldn't say. And there are days that I really have been ready to walk. Chuck has heard that from me before. He knows. Sometimes working in the church in some way can be what's the term? Life sucking, I think. I mean, it really, people can be worse sometimes in the faith community than they are in other places. And, you know, for example, I've been dealing for years and will be until she retires at the end of January with someone who has just been miserable to work with. But I live with it because I believe in what I'm doing. And I think that's really what it comes to.
Uh-huh. And that's, you do have a congregation now, or is it?
I don't have a congregation. I work for the Pennsylvania Council of Churches, so that is my full-time job, my full-time call, as they say. So, and I did work for a few months as an associate pastor in a Presbyterian church in York, Pennsylvania, but was called to this job shortly after I was ordained. And so I think, as I mentioned, I have this background in public policy studies as well as my MDiv. So those two things kind of meshed in this position.
Oh, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. I do have a very supportive congregation that I'm part of, though, which is wonderful.
Good.
So I think that, Mike, I've mentioned to you before that my mother's church in Tampa, Florida, has a Hispanic part of their calling is to be a beloved community, and they sponsor a Hispanic ministry, so they actually pay for an associate pastor who speaks Spanish and does a separate worship service, so that they can actually all understand the whole service and they can sing their own music that they're used to. I mean, a lot of people don't feel like they've actually experienced worship if they haven't sung the music that they're used to. And if you're expecting certain components of the service, whether it's certain prayers that you're used to, that you just don't feel like you worship, so you don't bother going if you're not getting what you went there for. So it might be helpful if you knew Hispanic people in your community to ask them specifically, oh, where are you having your spiritual needs met? And if they're already having their spiritual needs met, then what is your purpose? Are you trying to make yourself feel better about being diverse, or are you trying to meet somebody's spiritual needs?
Right.
So figure out what your purpose is. And if, like in my mother's community, their purpose is also to, well, in their community, there is a large Hispanic population, and their church is UCC. It's open and affirming. It's a place that you can welcome your entire family to be a part of the church, even if your kid is gay or something like that. And so so that's their calling in the community. And so, if there's something specific that your church offers like that, and you want to be more welcoming, then you could talk with them and say, if you don't have a spiritual home that's meeting your needs, then what would meet your needs? Like, what would you want to find in a church when you walk in the doors? What would help you feel welcome? What would help you feel worshipful, like and that your spiritual needs were being met? And that might mean some music that your other members might say, well, that wasn't worship. That's not what I'm used to. So you have to negotiate all these things.
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Yeah, I can tell you my own congregation actually started doing something a few years ago called AWE, or Alternative Worship Experience, which is very different than what you would see on a Sunday morning. And they've done everything from talking about the mystics to being in fellowship with the natural world and all kinds of things. And it's something that gives people an opportunity to come in and not feel intimidated by some kind of experience that they're not familiar with to begin with. There's a lot of discussion that goes on. There is some music, but and what we found is that we've had an awful lot of people who've joined then and have started going both on Sunday morning and to that service, because it was an entry, a way of coming into that community without feeling overwhelmed by the unfamiliar.
Yeah.
So I am going to actually ask you to back up and explain that again. So people who didn't usually go to your church might choose to go to this awe experience, and once they walked in your building, so the awe experience isn't something people are used to either, though. So how did that make them be more comfortable?
Well, I think it was people we had people from the congregation who have been members, and then we had people who were friends and others who had virtually no church experience, who really had not been involved in a faith community at all during their lives. And so, or they had been involved in something that was much less structured than what we do. For Presbyterians, we're a fairly high liturgy church. Not all are. But it was giving people an opportunity not to come into what might be this intimidating Sunday morning experience where they're expected to stand at certain times and sit at certain times and do this and do that. It was very comfortable, and then they would have a meal together afterward. People would bring food. And as I said, that was it. There are a lot of people who have never joined the church, but who come to that, and we're very happy to have them around because they do participate in the life of the community, even if they're not members of the church. So it has been a good way to build some of those relationships.
So what has your church been doing for building relationships in COVID times of social distancing? I'm assuming your building is shut and that you're worshiping online?
We do. My congregation for many years now has had a relationship with actually one of the local radio stations. So on Sunday mornings for years, they have broadcast the service from our church on Sunday mornings. Now, with the church closed, there is a small group that still gathers to do the worship service. We are actually not seeing it online, but we do have access to a bulletin online and can listen um, through this radio broadcast. But we have a small choir, socially distanced, just a handful of people to provide music. The organist, of course, is there. And then our pastor, we actually have two pastors, so typically both of them are involved. So you're talking about 10 or 12 people on Sunday morning that come together to do this service. But I do know that others have actually taped worship or videoed worship in advance. A number are doing it by Zoom. There's been a lot of different approaches to this. Some in counties that we've had this problematic designation here in Pennsylvania of this red, yellow, green. And people have seen green as just go full force, full steam ahead. And unfortunately, we're starting to have the cases rise again. So some congregations actually had started doing some worship again, but there are some who did that and have just added more services so that it gets spread out. So there's a lot of different approaches that folks have been taking.
So our building has been entirely shut down until a couple of weeks ago. They started letting the two secretaries come in, going to two different rooms, identifying which one could use which bathrooms. So they weren't using the same bathroom.
Oh, God. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really been hard. Our minister actually has accepted the call to another church. So her last Sunday with us is on August 9th.
Oh, God.
And so how do you do a search and find
That's so hard. I can't even
But I'm
imagine.
actually kind of relieved because she has been so picky about this. Plus our moderator is a nurse, and the past moderator has been stepping in and helping during this challenging time right now. She is a clinical psychologist who thinks of herself as being medical enough that she can recognize how very dangerous this all really is. Now I'm a physician and I can't recognize how dangerous it all really is. But I've been trying to figure out, well, why couldn't 3 or 4 people be in the sanctuary zooming that instead of zooming your dining room wall? And
Right.
why couldn't the organist who lives in a place with no cell service and doesn't get internet, why can't she go in and play during the worship instead of taping something in advance and recording it and sending and putting that on? And why couldn't the 4 people who have no internet come and be in the sanctuary for that service and everybody else be home with Zoom so we're not giving them any disease,
Right.
Why couldn't you have 8 people in the room, And oh my gosh. And then they go on about how, we'd have to remove all the cloth, all the cushions. I'm thinking here, wait, they do better than the wood surfaces,
Yeah.
What information are you using? And they've read all the stuff that UCC has put out, and I can't even keep up with all the stuff she forwards to me, but I'm like, this is just like OCD. I'm sorry.
Right. Well, as I said,
In Vermont, with our low count, we've had a total of 5 deaths.
Wow. In your community, not in your church.
No. Let me think here.
Because our congregation has been doing things this way since the middle of March, when everything started to shut down. And we've had no one who's gotten sick. And of course, they are careful and they, do what they need to do to keep people safe.
Right. In our entire county, I think over the whole time we've had 20 people test positive. I'm misremembering. So it's actually in the entire state since the beginning of March, we've had 55 people die of COVID, and that includes several nursing homes that had 18 people here and 5 people there. So in the whole state, we've had a total of 55 deaths.
Wow.
And over the entire period. And it's just so overreactive, and some of our older folks are just so isolated.
Yeah.
So I'm actually kind of relieved that the pastor is going somewhere else. We're figuring out the remote stuff of what do you do until you do call another pastor.
Right.
And so figuring out, well, what other services might we actually want to collaborate with, maybe with more diverse churches and learn more
Right.
in a spiritual setting. So we're just looking at the different things, but it is hard to think of. If you were already, Michael, trying to think of how do we welcome in Hispanics, for instance, how on earth do you welcome them to a Zoom service, you know?
Well, I haven't worked in my office since the middle of March, and I've been working at home, and that's been actually a blessing because of the situation I mentioned earlier. But I have had to go in a couple of times to pick up or drop things off, and I have this colleague who is really OCD, and there's signs everywhere that are so off-putting. That and I think we do need to do a good job of reminding people, hey, if you're out and around in the hallways and stuff, you should probably wear your mask. You don't need to worry about it if you're in your office and that kind of thing. Just the usual reminders, but it's like these sternly worded signs and messages that are just like, we're a faith organization. We should not be putting up these off-putting sort of things.
And they're so concerned about how will we keep the sanctuary clean, and like you use it once a week. You don't actually probably even need to clean it because all the virus particles
all of it
are
are gone.
Disintegrated by a week, you know.
Yeah. I don't think anybody has talked about that lasting for that long on a surface anywhere.
No.
I'm not a doctor, obviously, but just
Yeah.
from the reading I've done.
Yeah.
Well, I know we've gone way far afield of both, but
right. We've gone past the topic and past the time, and it's 10 o'clock at night. We so much appreciate the time that you've shared with us.
Oh, absolutely. This has been great.
Talking, I mean, in Vermont, we don't have, I actually, in my county, we actually do have 2 Buddhist colonies in the town next door, but not a lot of Hindus in the whole state, more of them in the Burlington area than over on my side. And the Jewish community is, it's a small Jewish community with people driving a very long distance to get to the service on Friday nights. So trying to be interfaith is a huge effort.
Yeah. Well, we actually looked at this COVID time as an opportunity to actually work more across the state on an interfaith basis, which has been wonderful because we can bring people together this way.
Right.
But
for rural areas, it really does have that blessing.
Yeah. I mean, you might find this kind of funny, but we actually have quite a large Hindu temple just outside of Harrisburg. But it's mostly, I think, because we have a pretty significant medical community in the area, and there's an awful lot of Indian healthcare workers.
Yeah.
So, because people will say, "Oh gosh, you've got this big temple. Why would you have that in Harrisburg?" And I think
Harrisburg is a big town, though, isn't it? How big is it?
What's that?
Harrisburg is pretty big. Isn't it a few 100,000?
The city itself is a little less than 50,000, I think, at this point. But the entire area, the metropolitan area is a couple of million.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that is large.
Yeah. I mean, it sprawls out, but yeah.
Yeah. But our whole state is 600,000, so.
Yeah. Pennsylvania is 12 million, roughly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you are, Rick. So, Rick, do you know Sandy?
No, I don't, but I have her email address now.
Okay.
I've been here, but I had unstable internet. I was trying to preserve my bandwidth.
Yeah.
So the rest of us had introduced ourselves to Sandy earlier in the call. So if you didn't mind just introducing yourself, as long as you're here sort of face to face, that would be nice, because you are one of our other faith members here. Thank you. Do you
Hi,
want to go ahead?
Sandy. I'm Rick Staggenborg. I'm with the First Christian Church in Albany, Oregon, and I do faith outreach for my local chapter of Healthcare for All Oregon, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the, or co-coordinators of the Healthcare for All Oregon Faith Caucus. We're just getting off the ground, so all of this is very relevant to what we're going to be doing. So I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Just a quick question. How big is Disciples in Oregon? We don't have very many here in Pennsylvania.
Oh, what's the denomination of your church, Rick?
Your Christian
First Christian,
church?
yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Are
First
you
Christian.
Disciples of Christ? Is that First
Yes.
Christian Disciple? Yeah,
Yeah.
I was asking how,
okay.
yeah. So, because I know in our area, we only have one congregation, and there aren't very many across Pennsylvania, so I wasn't sure how big your denomination was there.
I don't know for sure. I haven't really looked into that yet, but there's one in the neighboring town of Corvallis. They're in Salem, they're in Portland, so.
Sounds like there's more than we have.
Yeah, I don't think we
Probably,
have any
yeah.
in Vermont, in the whole state, I don't think.
Yeah.
So Rick, the Disciples of Christ is one of the denominations that has merged with the Congregationalists and the others to form the UCC, but not every church.
Not quite. They talked about it for several years, and in the end, they just couldn't agree on how the administration would work.
Oh,
but
I thought
neither one of them has a dogma, and so they're basically, in that sense, they're very much like UCC.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a lot of difference. In fact, they still consider themselves sister churches.
So in the Disciples of Christ, do churches like each congregation decides whether it will be open and affirming, or is there a denomination-wide decision on that, or how does that work?
No, it's a very democratic system, just like UCC.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
The individual congregations decide for themselves.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a number of what are called full communion agreements across different denominations, and in fact, we are in a full communion agreement with UCC. Presbyterians are. I went to a UCC seminary, and so yeah, I went to Lancaster Theological Seminary. So I have a lot of UCC friends, and their conference office is in our building. So yeah.
Yeah, we're a little different from UCC that way. We do it every time.
Yeah.
And it's open to everyone that walks through the doors, like UCC's, but we do it every time.
Right.
Is that the main difference between the two?
I'm not aware of a whole lot of other differences.
Yeah.
Mike, do you know?
No, I think we're very close theologically and public service.
And we're pretty close theologically too. Where we differ most is in terms of our polity. So we don't have the same kind of congregational polity that the UCC does. We're more hierarchical.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I guess one other difference is that we've in the past had difficulties reconciling our desire for unity with social activism. So we are not as socially active as UCC either. So although it presents a bit of a challenge, but I like a challenge.
I've met the Sharon Watkins. Is she still? She was the I don't remember what her title was, but for the National Church, I met her actually lobbying with the Children's Defense Fund around health care for kids a number of years ago. And I know she was really out there, but interesting.
Well, that's good to know. I'm new to the church, actually. I've only been a member for about a year. I was UCC in the past.
Okay.
Been on a congregation in town, so But yeah, when I'm hoping to network up, so it's good to know there's people up there that are already into this.
So Stefan, I see you put the link in there about the alternative worship experiences. Did you just look on that while we were talking and to hunt it up for us, or were you already familiar with that and you wanted to share something you already knew?
No, I was not familiar with that at all. I was just curious, like, because I didn't really quite have an idea of what it would be like. And so I just found the website that kind of explains it, just Sandy, a little bit like you also described it. And yeah, fascinating, like to have this alternative format for like a gathering at a church congregation.
Right. So Stefan, do you mind sharing whether you have a faith background? You don't have to if you don't want to.
No, sure, that's no problem. So myself, originally being from northern Germany, Germany is actually kind of north-south divided. So the southern part of Germany is predominantly Catholic, while the northern part of Germany is predominantly Lutheran. So myself, I grew up in a Lutheran church. Just like I grew up in a very small village of 180 people. Still, we did have a church. And
180?
Yes, 180, right.
Wow.
Yeah, but we did have a church, and I went, I sang in the choir and like the whole, kind of grew up in that church. And so, yeah, but I mean, obviously it's so interesting kind of just coming from Germany to the United States here, because in the United States, there are things that I think in that, to that extent at least, don't really exist in Germany. So in Germany, there are some, say, like evangelical congregations, but it's not like very popular, I feel, at all. It's a very small fringe, while like here in the United States, I just noticed, especially when I was in the South, like my wife, she used to live in Central Florida for a couple of years and stuff. So, I mean, they have these mega churches, and it's just, yeah, I've never seen something like that before. So, yeah, and of course now here it's interesting to see all the different denominations in Germany. I think there would be like no real equivalent to the United Church of Christ or something like that. So there's a lot of denominations here that we don't really have in Europe, I think. So, and yeah, but myself, I'm very happy like for the experiences that I had in Germany. So, say like later in my 20s as a university student, I attended the mission center of the so-called North Albion Lutheran Church. So it's a very northern part of Germany. And so actually they had lots of seminars which were so great on the whole concept of one world, that it's not like, we have an industrialized world and like a third world or whatnot, but it's like all one world. And so we actually had people, for example, from Samoa, for example, come to that mission center, like, and they had like a church there in Samoa, not American Samoa, but the other one. And they kind of like explained to us, for example, oh, well, we live on an island here in the Pacific Ocean, and the maximum elevation is like 18 feet. And, we live like a traditional life, like without electricity or without technology and stuff like that. But like, the storms are just more frequent, and like, more and more of our island is kind of affected, and eventually it might just disappear from the map and stuff. But anyway, it was wonderful to kind of, as part of the mission center that kind of also has like a worldwide like outreach, so to speak, to be able to make all of these connections and learn from fellow human beings. So, yeah, lots of good experiences.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone.
So much. We probably should let you all go to bed. Thank you, everyone. And the next OPS office hours is August 11th. And I have two medical students who both offered to do that night because we had a little mix-up. But I thought one of them was doing it tonight, one was doing it next time, but they both thought they were doing it next time. So we'll see which one does. And for the beginner one. So if you know of anybody who can help with publicizing to draw in more people who want to know more about single payer, they're not already experienced activists, they're ready to learn more, then that would be super. And then Willie Fleming will be the one speaking about building the movement, specifically looking at reaching out to the African American community.
So, Betty, that's August 11th, or which day is that?
Yeah.
Tuesday, August 11th.
Tuesday.
Oh, wow, that's second Tuesday of the week. Then we have our Medicare for All Connecticut monthly meeting, always the second Tuesday.
Oh, okay. We should talk to Chuck about that, because I have a conflict on second Tuesdays too. And I thought, well, this doesn't start till 7. I have to be there at 6:30. The other meeting starts at 6. I'll bug out, or I'll just be there for a half hour and bug out. But if it's going to be a consistent issue for you too, let's talk to him and do maybe the second Wednesday and then the fourth Tuesday or something like that.
Good.
Okay, great.
Well, thank you so much, Sandy.
Thank you, everyone. Great to meet you, Sandy. Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you all too. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Take care. Good night.
Yes, have a good night, everyone.